The guest for this episode is Michelle Woods. She spoke about analyzing translations, the objective subjectivity of translators, different translations of Kafka over the years, and how each of these provided us with great insights into Kafka's work. Michelle Woods is a professor of English at SUNY New Paltz. She is the author of Kafka Translated, How Translators Have Shaped Our Reading of Kafka, Censoring Translation, Censorship, Theatre and the Politics of Translation, and Translating Milan Kundera. She is writing a non-fiction book about the female translators of Anna Karenina called Reading Anna. To buy the book, Kafka Translated, How Translators Have Shaped Our Reading of Kafka, you may please use the link given in the show notes. Please review and follow the Harshniyam podcast on Spotify and Apple podcasting apps.
So I'm half Czech, half Irish. So my mother, she left Prague in 1968, actually just before the Soviet invasion, and didn't go back. So that's why I'm here. And so growing up in, of course, the 80s, I was reading a lot of Czech literature and translation, and 1989 happened, and I was a teenager, and it was so exciting, to see this country become democratic again, and we went there, and it was just wonderful. And so I just had this real interest in Czech literature. And when I finished my degree, my initial degree was in English and Russian. But then I really wanted to write about Milan Kundera. I had a real interest in his work. And so I decided to do my PhD, and it became really clear when I started doing research that the translations were the major thing, the major issue with his work, So that's how I got interested in him. And I mean, Václav Havel was one of my heroes, like most people, a dissident who became president after the fall of communism, a good, decent man. And so what happened is, after I finished my PhD, I went to look at an archive of one of Kundera's translators in New York. And the first day at the archivist said to me, "Well, we just got the archive of Havel's translator. Are you interested?" And so I spent a few weeks on the Kundera translator archive, and then the rest of the few months, because it was huge, it was this massive archive. And so that's what got me interested in Havel and the translation issues with his work. Yeah. So that's really it. I mean, it's my background that got me interested in Czech literature. And with all of them to some extent, but certainly Havel and Kundera, it's a real narrative of the Cold War, why they were translated after 68, and kind of Western interest in this country that had been taken over by the Soviets, and the kind of narrative that the West tends to like to talk about itself as this place of freedom, but it's more complicated than that. And it tended to politicize the readings of these writers, which is interesting. It's an interesting reading, but there was a lot more to their work than that. And I think they both felt that they were slightly misunderstood in the West as only political writers, whereas for both of them, I think they're kind of obsessed by language, and what language does to it.
He used to criticize his translators.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's not because of his translators, but the way they are edited, I think, is the issue.
Yes, that's something I found, because I ended up going to Kundera's, his first major American publisher was Knopf. It's a very good publisher. But I discovered that actually a lot of the things that he was unhappy with came down to the editor's decision, because she didn't like his long sentences, the repetitions, and so a lot of it was happening in post-translation, right? It was kind of the editing of them. And he there are quite a few letters where he's getting really frustrated with her, and he says, "Please put down your pencil, Miss Editor," But I can see from her point of view, she wanted a commercial success, because he was getting quite successful in France with Gallimard. But he wasn't getting, they weren't selling as many books as they wanted. And so there was this sense that they needed to Americanize the prose a little bit for him to be successful. So, yeah, it's unfortunate. Publicly, he went after Michael Henry Heim, who's a great translator, and Peter Cussy as well. And even his French translator, who was a good friend of his for many years, François Hirsch, who translated under the name Kael, they ended up falling out as well. So it's terrible because I think in his public writings, it seems like he can't stand the translators. It's all their fault, but I think it's a much more complicated story than that. At the same time, I think when I started my PhD, I thought it was going to be really critical of Kundera, and I ended up kind of understanding where he was coming from, because his idea was what was being changed was what was translatable, which for him was, he does use a lot of repetition, like Kafka. He gets it a bit from Kafka and Tolstoy, I think. He's very influenced by, and he does use, sentences of different length. Czech has got longer sentences, like German with Kafka. But he was getting frustrated that people didn't understand that he was doing something quite musical with his language, which you can really hear, in Czech. And it's hard to translate the euphony of it, but you can translate the breath and the melody of the, and that's, I think he felt people were just reading him as this political writer, with this very kind of, not, I wouldn't say boring prose, but very clear prose that wasn't doing anything interesting with language. He was no Joyce or whatever. But so I think he felt misunderstood about that. So I found that really interesting when I looked at what was being changed in his translations and what he was arguing for in some ways. Yeah.
So your PhD thesis is about Milan Kundera's translations.
Yeah, what was interesting is that, because he went back, so he was super successful with The Unbearable Lightness of Being in the mid-'80s, 1984. We spent the next 2 years retranslating his French translations with Kael, and which is hilarious, because you think he'd want to write his next best-selling novel, but he just, but what I discovered when he was doing that was that he was actually rewriting his novels. He was taking stuff out, he was changing sentences, so my PhD was really looking at this idea, how he complicates, like a lot of self-translators, complicates the idea of the original, because at one point he says, actually, I don't have originals for any of my novels anymore, because there's the Czech version, there's the French translation, which is kind of updated. And what I discovered that, he did then revise his English translations. And then when he republished his novels in Czech, he changed them as well. So none of them are the same textually. So I found that fascinating, and when I wrote the book, that it's a little different from the thesis, I discovered that he, even in his early work, he was a poet in the 1950s, a very bad poet, it has to be said. He was a terrible poet, but he even rewrote, his poetry collections came out in 2 or 3 editions, and even at that young age, he was rewriting. Every time a new edition came out, he was rewriting them. So he's quite obsessive, like that. So, so that was the thesis. That was what fascinated me, and this idea of how we valorize the original, but actually, it's a very complicated idea, really.
We interviewed translators and some writers too, but we have never come across a person who analyzes translation.
I know.
You talked about all 3 of the people I mentioned. You came out with books, analyzing their translation.
Well, maybe because I'm an obsessive nerd. I don't know, but no. What interests me, because I'm really a literary scholar. That's my training, and what I love about thinking about translation, obviously, since I always write about it, is that you can really look at. You could closely read a text. You're really looking at the tiny bits of language and what language is doing, but it's always connected to these bigger issues: historical, political issues, social issues, personal issues, biographical issues as well. And I love that mix of the micro and the macro, right? But it's very factual as well, because you can see the evidence in the text. And what's interesting about comparing translations or looking at what the translator does is you see them interpreting, they're reading the text, right? They're not just translating from one language to another, but they're making decisions about it. And so every time you come to the problems in the text where there seems to be an issue with the translation, it's often a really interesting element of the aesthetics or the poetics of the text. And so I love that, because it makes me really reread the work in different ways. And I think thinking about translation also made me understand, or helped me to understand, how musical prose and even theatre can be, because we think of poetry and everyone talks about the translation of poetry, and how we have to think about melody and sound and euphony, but people are a little more lackadaisical about prose. They just think, well, it's just the story, it's not that hard. But actually, when you get close to prose, you realize that and to me, this is the difference between great writers and good writers. A great writer has a pulse. There's something going on musically, I think, in the prose. But that's often the hardest thing, or the thing that's ignored often with prose writers and some theatre playwrights as well. So I thought that was really, so that's where my obsession is. It's really a kind of, as a reader, I'm fascinated by these other readers, people who've also read the text and maybe read it in a completely different way to me, but that challenges how you read it. So yeah, I guess that's where my obsession comes from.
See, I love translators forward and translator notes in every book. I look for that.
Yeah.
But when I was reading your book, because I believe translator notes makes me a more attentive reader, a better reader of the book.
Yeah.
But likewise, the book, the Kafka Translated, definitely it made me a better reader, because you compared all these styles and you come out with those fine nuances where normally as a reader I tend to ignore.
Yeah. No, yeah.
That's the best part about that book, Kafka Translated.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm fascinated by Kafka because he plays with the reader so much. Like, he's having fun with us. And I didn't realize, when I first read him when I was a teenager, I was very serious, and I took him as this depressing, which is some of my students are they're looking for this kind of depressed writer who writes about, these dystopian kind of hellscapes, that people are caught in. But he's so funny. I think he really plays with the idea of, he makes you want to interpret his text all the time, right? That what does it mean? What's the court? What's this village? What's the castle? Like, you really want to find out what it means and get to the bottom of it. But he never lets you, he just teases you and brings you along with him all the time. And when I reread him, thanks to Kundera, I read, Kundera's nonfiction, where he writes a lot about Kafka. He kept writing about how funny Kafka was, and I thought, I don't believe that. And when I went back to reread him in my early 30s, I was laughing. I mean, it was so funny, and I'd missed that humor. And I think part of it is, I just love when a writer's teasing you a bit and making you think and getting you frustrated. The castle, I think I write about it in the book, that everyone's in beds, every time he goes somewhere, someone's in a bed. And then he goes on these long, long passages. And my students, when I teach the book, they get so frustrated. It's the last book that we do in our Kafka course. And they're just like, why are we reading this? I want to throw the book, against the wall. It's just so frustrating. And I said, because he's teasing you, he makes you want to sleep. He's boring you. And the problem is that as Kay is going in this village, he keeps almost falling asleep when someone's about to tell him the answer about the castle. And so it really interests me the way that these books make you feel like you physically have a reaction to them. And so I think he's a wonderful writer that way, that he's forcing you all the time to stay awake and to really think about why that sentence is never ending, and why you're going along with it. And so it's really, it's kind of fascinating to me that a book can do that. It can make you just really, have this kind of somatic relationship with it, that that fascination.
Now, before we move on with Kafka, the other book that you wrote is Censoring Translations. I read about it. I have not read the book. But what is interesting to me is, normally all the time we talk about political censorships. In this book, you have touched upon other forms of censoring.
Yeah, I mean, it came out of the Translators archive. She was very interesting. Viera Blackwell. She escaped from Czechoslovakia in the 1950s, and then translated Havel's plays. But she ended up in this kind of frustrating position where she was arguing for people to understand that, because Havel's a very prolix writer. There's a lot of language in his plays, and every time it actually took quite a while for his plays to be put on in England. He had a champion in Joseph Papp of the Public Theatre in New York, but other than that, no one was that interested, and people were frustrated with the plays because they were like, "These are really boring. It's just all this language." And we get the idea, aren't they? They're a dissident. It's about it's this anti-communist thing. Why do we have to listen to it? And I discovered through this archive that a lot of theatres and producers, directors were just cutting a lot of the language out of the plays. So this narrative of Havel, who was imprisoned for his dissidence against the communist regime, he was seen as this hero, this anti kind of, who was censored and banned, and but actually once his work got into the West, people were editing it really strongly, really taking quite a lot of liberties with the text. And the translator, Blackwell, she kept arguing against it. And she was writing these long kind of screeds saying, you don't understand what he's doing. And part of Havel's point was that language is what imprisons us. That we use, the more we speak, it's probably what I'm doing now, the more we speak, the more we kind of tie ourselves up. And he was really interested from the communist period about how we imbibe cliches and language, and that and then we just spout it out again. And that's the dangerous thing about language, rather than whatever you're espousing. So the memorandum, second play, it's set in a business, and these people they're just coming out with this kind of business jargon all the time. And, it seems in some ways his plays are even more contemporary, if you think that we've turned into these social media, we're spouting all that. So, but that was never understood because he was just saying people didn't get why he was using so much language to do this. So he's interested in thinking about market censorship, the idea that in order for the plays to be successful in England and the US, they wanted short, clear plays that were clearly political, that would satisfy people's kind of beliefs about what was going on in this terrible communist regime, this dissident. So that idea of market censorship was fascinating to me, and I've continued having a fascination with it because I think we don't like to think about that. We don't like to think about what doesn't get made, or what's kind of silently silenced, because we like to believe we live in this very, kind of neoliberal, free, kind of democratic world. And so that was one of the censorships I was looking at. And another one was this idea of gender censorship. I was just interested in the way that no one took Blackwell seriously, partly because she was a foreigner. There's a large degree of xenophobia against her. She spoke perfect English, her letters are amazing, and her English is better than mine, but she was seen as somehow faulty because she wasn't a natural born English speaker. But also because she was a woman, the theatre world was heavily male in terms of who was getting to decide which plays were being put on and who was directing them and who the taste makers were. So I was really interested by it was so evident in the archive with the letters that she was getting, and people's remarks were shocking, and this is the 60s, 70s, but still it was hard to take. And I've been interested in kind of female translators and the kind of barriers that they face. We always talk about the invisibility of the translator, but for women sometimes it's a double invisibility because they don't have, or they haven't had, they haven't had really cultural power, more so now, but with some of the translators that I've looked at, they were incredibly frustrated in their archives with the way that they were effectively silenced. No one was interested in them. So I was interested in the idea. I think we have sometimes an unnuanced idea of censorship. We think it's just one way. It's these dictatorships, these authoritarian places. But in fact, there's an awful lot of censorship going on. Well, it makes me sound paranoid, but there are these censorships we don't like to talk about that I think I was interested in exploring that.
The other book I read about this, it's not exactly about censoring the translation, it's
Violent Phenomena.
Violent Phenomena touches upon many of these things. Interesting.
It's such a great book. I love the essays in there, and I think it's really true. It's this, translation it's a very white, and translation theory too. and I think quite a patriarchal place, as well. And so I think that's a great book for just saying, hang on a minute, we've got to rethink about the translation world, about who's getting to do what and who has power and who gets to say what translation is. And I think it's a really important publication, no, it's a great book.
Now, Kafka Translated, how translators shaped our understanding of Kafka. Why did you take up writing this book?
I think I got interested actually really in the Czech translator Milana Jesenska, because she was Kafka's lover, though, I think mostly textual, they had this correspondence.
No, I felt it's all textual.
Yeah, it's all textual, which I think is wonderful. I mean, it's got a great beauty to it, but I found that there was this weird, she'd become this kind of cliche, and she was always referred to as Milana, right? She's never referred to by her full name, and as this kind of almost figment of Kafka's imagination. But when I went to reread the letters, you just realized how interested he was. She was the first person ever to translate his work. She translated some stories. And so the correspondence begins with him asking for the translations and then loving like he's really interested in it, and he's interested in her writing. She was a journalist as well. She'd gone to Vienna. She'd had to go because she was Czech and Christian, and she ended up marrying and eloping with a Jewish German-speaking man, Ernst Polak, who's part of Kafka's and Max Broad's circle. And I just got very interested in her, and her writings are fabulous. I mean, really frank. She was writing in early 1920s. She was broke in Vienna. That was a paralyzed capital after the fall of the Austro-Hungarian regime, empire. And but she was writing about divorce. She's writing about her suicide attempt. She was writing about, all these kind of it was so modern, her writing. So it was really, I was very interested in her and interested in these Czech translations of Kafka's work, because our image of Kafka is that he was never published in his lifetime, like no one knew who he was. But the first Czech translation that she published, which was of the Judgment, they put, I know it was The Stoker, the first chapter of his novel, his unfinished novel, America. And the magazine it was published in published the whole story and then put at the end, we don't usually use the whole issue for one story, but we thought this was a great piece of writing. And so it was great to see that he was getting recognition in Czech, and unusually for the German-speaking community, he spoke Czech because most of his father's employees were Czech. They had Czech maids and so on. So he was aware of it, and so I thought that was a really wonderful story. So that was how I got interested, actually. And then I found out that Willa Muir, who was the first English translator with her husband of Kafka's work, had an archive, and I ended up going to her archive, and that was fascinating. And so it's really through these translators that I got interested in Kafka and what was going on and with his work. That's how I got interested, really. And then after speaking to Mark Harmon and Michael Hoffman as well, they were both so fascinating about the translation experience, so it's great to have contemporary translators too, but yeah, I mean, there are many translators I could have interviewed, really, but I just thought the four of them made kind of interesting cases in their own rights, and also the idea that Kafka changes for each generation, that people, and especially with Mark Harmon, what was interesting, because Max Brod, when he edited the English the text that the English translations were based on, because these novels, with the three novels, they were unfinished, and he decided to make them more readable or kind of give them a story. He moved stuff around, and so the newer translations have kind of gone back to the manuscripts, really, and the newly or relatively newly edited German editions. And for Mark Harmon, I thought was interesting was that, I thought that English readers were finally ready to see the experimental Kafka, right? The Kafka with the long sentences, and the book ends mid-sentence. And, so I was really interested in the idea that we're ready now as readers to approach Kafka as he was, rather than a kind of more readable Kafka. Yeah.
See, in this book, you made certain observations. I want you to either comment or elaborate on that.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that you say is a translator is a literary being partially constructed by the history of their reading in the source and the target languages.
No, it's fascinating to see. Think about translators makes me think about my own reading as well, and how we're so individual as readers, right? That
Correct.
we've all, we might have read the classics or whatever, but we read so much, such a variety of things, that when we come to a text as a reader, we're coming to it with this very, very idiosyncratic, very kind of, background, that we're responding to it as a textual being. It's like we're made up of books. And I think for translators, especially so, because they're reading in two different languages at least. And so their knowledge and what they bring, I think what's amazing as readers is not only a knowledge of the writer they're translating, but also the context, the linguistic and cultural kind of world that writer comes from, which is often transnational, right? We often think of Czech writers or German writers, and Kafka is such a tough one because everyone argues whether he's Austrian or Czech or German or whatever. But you realize that the writers are reading transnationally as well. But what's great about the translators is their awareness of the different worlds they're translating out of and into, these literary and cultural worlds. And that's a real... that's where the translator prefaces and their writings are so useful, because I think they're giving us a way into seeing the writer in their milieu, as well. And, I was really struck by taste, certainly when it came to Mark Harmon, who, he writes about Beckett and Joyce. And so he really sees Beckett in Kafka, and you could really see it in the translation. There were some passages that, and Beckett, claimed never to have read The Castle or never to have finished it because it was just too hard, which is hilarious. But there are parts of his novel, his unnameable trilogy, where he just, it could be Kafka, this steamroller style, as he says. And with Harmon, you really saw the Beckett in his Kafka. You could really see how his reading, what it brought to his translations, and even in the rhythms of it. And we were talking earlier, and I think I got interested in Mark Harmon because I saw him give a reading in New York, and I hadn't realized. I think I knew he was Irish, but I hadn't realized he'd still have he's got the Irish rhythms. And he was reading the opening of America, which is a novel about immigration, So it's very moving. Here I'm an immigrant to America as well. Mark Harmon is, and it's about this young man immigrating, and actually saying bad things about the Irish in the opening pages, beware of the Irish, And so Mark Harmon, he read, and just the rhythms, it brought me back home in a way. And I thought that was fascinating, that our ear, depending where we've grown up, our ear are different when it comes to the rhythms of language, the rhythms of English or whatever language we're reading in. And so that was fascinating. And the other thing with Michael Hoffman too, he's a very famous translator. He just won a big prize. He translated Jenny Erpenbeck's book, Kairos. But when I read, the German literature that he translated, and there was you could see that he had a very certain taste, that he liked very darkly funny material. And you could see him building up this canon, in a sense, an unusual canon, but because he has some kudos, I think, as a translator in the English-speaking world, he was able to bring in this slightly this funny German literature into English. And so it's really interesting to see his taste come through all of these books that were different, but, there was a similar thread there. So I became really interested in how the really individual voice that a translator brings to any given author, and that's where it's wonderful if we have multiple translations, because you can really see that when you compare them, and often they're seen as mistakes, or they're attacked for being mistakes. But I've become more and more convinced that they're not. It's never really. I think Mark Harmon was very honest. He said, "Look, in a novel, 400-page novel, there's going to be a mistake or two. It's inevitable." But the rest of it is choice. It's the translator hearing what they're hearing, and that, to me, instead of criticizing it, I think it brings us into these interesting places. It's a portal into reading the book or the work. Yeah.
What makes the book very interesting is normally when you're comparing translations, you compare the approach and how they have translated and all, but you have given lengthy accounts of their background too, their family background, their literature.
Yeah.
It made it very interesting. And Mark Harmon, you have given a very, very lengthy, background, and also there is a lengthy interview from Michael Hoffman in the book.
No, I'm interested because we forget, sometimes we talk about translators, and it's what's great about your podcast, you're interviewing these translators, we forget that they're people, they're human beings, and I was getting slightly frustrated with, I think it's the case with a lot of reviews of translation, where people just see translators as, if they mention them at all, as just these textual beings. And
no, the only sentence I keep reading when they review the translation, most of the reviews anyway, it never appeared to me as a translation.
Right. I know it is. It's it was a good job because I forgot about. Yeah, I know. Or if they're trying to be nice, it's like, oh, it's a fluent translation, yeah, or it's a this. But it's terrible, because I think it misses the opportunity to think about the translator as a reader who's coming with this interpretation, and even if you disagree with it, it's they're doing something interesting. And the other translation kind of review, and we see it with Coetzee's review of Harmon's translation, where people like to nitpick. They speak. So Coetzee speaks German, so he's like, well, this is the wrong translation of this, and there's a famous Janet Malcolm, who was a wonderful critic, a wonderful writer herself. But in 2016, I think she just excoriates some contemporary translations of Anna Karenina by choosing certain words, and she's just angry about it. But the problem is, I think, it's Mark Harmon is a great word for it. He says it's a gotcha criticism, But when you look more into it, you realize that actually it's a more complicated story, and I think some critics want to show their own prowess, their linguistic prowess, or their knowledge prowess by saying this is wrong, Coetzee, I think I talk about it in the book, he mentions that shambles, it's just the wrong word. It's not a word that Kafka, suits Kafka, or wasn't around when Kafka was writing. And, it's a kind of quite an ancient word, but it is, it's been around for a long time. But it's really problematic, because it's really suggesting that the translator is somehow inadequate, rather than a thinking being.
Who's making conscious choices.
Yeah, who's making conscious choices, and even if it doesn't ring, even if you read it and you're like, oh, I don't like that word shambles or whatever, but that's a good thing, because it makes you think about, well, what's going on here? Why have they chosen that? And so, yeah, I think there's a certain lack of generosity in translation criticism sometimes, and a lack of interest in the translator's knowledge, because they're these intimate readers of the text. And I think, not to use that is a real pity, because they can tell us so much about what's going on linguistically, and not only linguistically, but how that relates to the wider framework of the book,
Yeah. Now, other thing that you wrote about is you are extending what Borges has said about writers, right? Every translator also creates their own precursors, writers, translators, which are as bound to influence their own reading of the work they translate. This is the other thing which caught my attention.
No, I think because I think with this idea of the precursor, it is very Borgesian.
Yeah.
But that we're thinking of translators they're adding to a canon, and they're giving us a gift, I think, in many ways, but they're opening up. So for me, with Hoffman, for instance, it brought me back to reading, things that he translated that I wouldn't have read, and he's opening up this world of writers who you could see how it made sense that he'd get to Kafka. You could see their relationship. I mean, Kafka's been so influential as a writer, on Borges included, in the 20th and 21st century. And so thinking about how the translators bring their own background, whether it's Beckett or someone else, Bernhard or something, to Kafka, but then their translations of Kafka then become, they're going to influence other writers and translators as well. So there's this lovely chain of literary being, that's changing, I think, the fabric of kind of literature and our, how we read. So I think it's fascinating.
Next, a couple of questions, you have touched upon them already. Like, you have compared, of course, Jasenska. Other than Jasenska, you compared Muirs, Mark Harmon, Michael Hoffman, these three. What do you think each of these translators brought to the table as far as Kafka's translations are concerned to the reader?
I think for Muir, the whole story with her was that she worked with her husband, Edwin Muir, who was quite a well-known poet and critic. And she wrote a memoir that's actually quite wonderful called Belonging, where she said it was absolutely equal, the work we did. We split the book in half,
And so she has done the most of creative work,
Yeah. She said, I did the work, but no one would believe me, and so. But what was interesting is that because Kafka, because he'd been published in a small press in Berlin after he died, broad published, but then the Nazis came to power, so the books were destroyed because he was a Jewish writer. So in fact, he didn't really become famous in Germany until after the war, but by which time he'd become really famous in English. And so I think Will and Edwin Muir, they're interesting because they were the reason that we have Kafka as this kind of world famous writer. It was their translations that really disseminated and empowered kind of Kafka, who seemed to be such a in some ways seemed to anticipate the horrors of World War II and Stalinism and so on. What's interesting about the Muir's translation, it's really criticised partly because it's Max Broad's edited versions of the novels, for instance. But it's criticised as being too po-faced, too kind of uptight in some ways. But what was interesting when I looked into the Muirs is that they came from a non-English speaking background. Both of them grew up in tiny islands off the coast of Scotland and grew up speaking Scots, which is a kind of mixture of Gaelic and English, and so you could really see them. It's because in her archive she's got some writing in Scots where she's hilarious. She's really funny. It's got this. She's playing with English and so on. And I realised that they were putting on a kind of armour when they were writing in English. And I feel a bit the same because I grew up speaking Dublin English, right? It's got its own strange rhythms and words and so on. But once you become an academic, people expect you to write in a particular, formal academic English, right? So, there's always that struggle where you're putting on a voice, you're putting on your armour, your linguistic armour. So I was really interested in that, how that played out, and then being very dry, I think, in their translations of Kafka, because I think they felt that's what it was supposed to be. That's the only way it would get accepted. With Harmon, as I've mentioned, I think with him, the rhythms to me sound so Irish, especially when you read Kafka out loud. It's just got this. It's got this. I don't know how to explain it. It's a very. It's just an accent. And I try and talk about it in the book. I don't know how successful I am in persuading readers of that. I think maybe more in seeing the Bechtian influence on his translation. Hoffman is very funny too, because he was born in Germany. He's got a came from a German family, but his English, it's very British. His translations, and some people don't like his Kafka translations. They find them too British. He does use these really slightly archaic now. I mean, they make sense to me because, I heard a lot of British English in the 70s and 80s. But I really like it. It's this very funny, it's almost like a Faulty Towers kind of element to it, And I like that. I like it. There's a real personal stamp on it. And I think the problem is a lot of people hate that. They hate, not hate it, but they want Kafka, they want the real Kafka, right? As if that's possible if you're not reading him in German. But I think, the translators, I love kind of hearing the translator stamp, like their personal stamp on how the language is. So they're quite different, the translations. Not hugely, I mean, not in terms of, missing text or anything like that, but just in terms of, I would say, the rhythms, And Kafka's a writer, I think you have to read out loud, and he's famous, I mean, that's how he used to read to his friends, and Max Brod said, we'd be laughing, everyone would be laughing on the floor when Kafka read, and Mark Harmon said, I don't know if it's in the book, but he told me he gave this reading in Berlin of the English translation when he was working on The Castle, I think. And he gave a reading, and this German woman came up to him and she was really shocked. She said, I never knew he was funny until I heard you reading him, reading out loud. Yeah. And so, but that's exactly how Kafka, I think, heard his work, right? Because it was meant to be spoken. And I find that I do that in class if we're reading Kafka, and students can find him tough going, especially the novels, but we'll sit and we'll just read passages out loud, and then they can hear the humor, right? These endless sentences, you can't breathe, you're being pushed onward and onward, and the oddity of some of the things, like Joseph K, these guys come to arrest him and he's trying to find his bicycle license to prove who he is, and it's stuff that you might miss when you're reading it, but just reading it silently to yourself. But the details are just wonderful. These very odd details. So I think I'm interested in translator accent, I guess, in some ways. That I know is problematic, I think, for some readers who don't want to hear it. They want their fluent translation that's somehow a transparent version of the writer's work. Yeah.
So your search is all the time trying to find translator's voice. Can I say that?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Now, you talked about Coetzee's criticism of Herman's work. If you were to write about what should critic do, what should be the critic's approach towards translation, what would you say? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I think, I think they should write more about it, right? It's hard. I mean, I don't know what the situation in India is like, but here in the States and in England, there's less and less literary reviewing, full stop.
It's next to nil in India.
Yeah, and so I think as an art, it's kind of dying off too, and I think in the past there were a lot of critics who were multilingual or bilingual who knew the language they might be talking about. And Coetzee, to be fair, has German, and so was reading it. So I think that's part of it, this whole. But I think also it really struck me how few reviewers go and read or listen to podcasts that the translators do, right? Or read, because a lot of translators are writing in blogs. I mean, it's been a great thing about the internet. So you can find a lot about what they've been thinking about. They'll write about the book and you find that a lot of reviewers don't bother. Like, there's no interest in finding out what the translator's background is, where they're coming from, what their argument about the book is, or the translation is. And it seems to me such a lack, just a really blind way. So I think that would be I think if anyone has the chance to do some literary reviewing, is to really read about the translator, not just kind of try and find the gotcha moments, there's some online things like LitHub here and Electric Literature where people do take Words Without Borders, which does a lot of translations, who do they're doing great criticism, and so I hope that changes it a bit. But I find, I teach in an English department, but I teach a lot of literature and translation, and I realize my students, they don't even think about the translator until until I mention it, and yeah, there's always kind of a weird reaction to it. They're suspicious at first, and I try to get them to find out more about the translator, and then they get interested. They're really so when I teach the Kafka course, we read some of Jasenska's articles, we read the letters, and they're always fascinated, by it. So yeah, no, I think it's just being aware, and maybe the internet's been helpful that way, that we're more aware of translators. Yeah, yeah. But something like this podcast is great too, I think getting their voices out there as well.
No, to make this podcast better, I had to read better.
But that's what the translators give us, right? They give us this opportunity to read in a different way, I think. Yeah.
Sometimes after the podcast, after I interview them, I go back and read some of the portions that they have mentioned, which I might have got it completely wrong sometimes.
Yeah, no, I love that, because I think when I read very quickly, and sometimes I read too quickly. So that's the great thing when you start thinking about when a translator says, well, this was really tough because, and then you go back and it makes you completely read it in a different way. It's quite wonderful. Yeah.
So what are you currently working on, Michelle?
So I've just finished a book. You're going to laugh because I'm obviously obsessed about the English translations of Anna Karenina. And
okay, wonderful.
And again, it's a lot of female translators. Constance Garnett, of course, and I was also interested in that there's a character, she's got an archive, she's a person, not a character, an archive in the New York Public Library. And she was translating Tolstoy in the 1880s. And she went to visit the Tolstoys' Tsarskoye Selo, their estate. And she was writing for some of the big magazines in America, The Atlantic, The Nation, and she wrote this article about visiting the Tolstoys in the Atlantic, and I think it came out in 1889. So it's really, quite early. But she's hilarious. She just can't stand Tolstoy at all. She just thinks because he's getting more and more polemic, and she just thinks his polemic writings aren't as nuanced as his fiction. But she makes great friends with Mrs. Tolstoy, with Sophia Tolstoy. And it's a great portrait of Tolstoy's wife. And I got very interested in her too, because she translated her husband's work into French as well. But is an amazing character. She also wrote a 1,000-page memoir. And she has her diaries as well. And, they had a fairly turbulent marriage, and she's so frank. It's quite shocking. And she says the funniest things about Tolstoy. So anyway, I got interested in her, in this translator, Isabel Hapgood, and Garnett as well, who was much more radical than I think I realized. She's seen as the kind of Victorian, when she's really the Edwardian translator of Tolstoy, but she was actually, she lived in an open marriage. Her husband lived with another woman, and they happily coexisted. She fell in love with a Russian revolutionary, and was taught Russian by another Russian revolutionary. So she's moving quite radical circles. She dated George Bernard Shaw, and so I was very interested in her translating this book about adultery and marriage, given her own background. Yeah, so it's a similar, it's writing about these translators, but it really opened up Tolstoy's writing. There's a great preface, a recent translation of Anna Karenina by Marion Schwartz, and it's a short preface, but it just changed my mind about Tolstoy's aesthetics, because I studied Russian. I had to read Anna Karenina in Russian, and it was great because it's really quite simple, and that's deliberate on Tolstoy's part. He makes it a very, it's not a kind of complex in terms of linguistic style, and he was criticized at the time in Russia. People said he was no Turgenev, right, because he couldn't write these beautiful poetic passages about the Russian countryside. But I realized that this is through Kundera's writing about repetition. He was using an awful lot of repetition. Sometimes, the repetition of a word in 10 times in a paragraph. And this was seen as a mistake. And even his wife in her diary writes this. She says he's just repeating too much stuff, and but he won't take it out, and it's meant to be there, I guess, And so some translators, so the Mauds, they did these translations in the 1918, I think, around that time, that are still used, right? People still read them. But they took all of that repetition out, and they produced this lovely English. But it ended up kind of defanging a lot of what Tolstoy was doing. There's a great scene where, Kitty, the young Kitty who's in love with Vronsky, she's going to her ball and she loves Anna. She just thinks she's the best, but she's swirling around. Kitty's moving round and round. And she sees Anna, and she uses this word, enchanting. She says, "Oh, she's so enchanting. Look how enchanting she is, enchanting, enchanting." So you can hear her in that repetition of the word, just being swirled round and round. But then she notices Vronsky looking at Anna, and there's just this realization that he's in love with Anna, that she's lost this man she thinks she's in love with. And she says, yes, there was something cruel and awful in Anna's enchantment. So the idea of the enchantment goes from meaning one thing, oh, she's beautiful, look how great she looks, to Anna being the sorceress who's stolen the guy she's fallen in love with away from her. So you really see him use that repetition. But it's how the translators deal with that, And so Janet Malcolm, I mentioned, she excoriated the recent translators, including Marion Schwartz. And she says, it just makes him sound awkward. Like you should smooth out. Essentially, we want the nice kind of fluent Tolstoy, But actually that, and so it made me realize, reading the translators and the issues with the translators, how kind of proto-modernist Tolstoy was. He was actually quite experimental with the way he was using language in this simple but really effective style. But I was really interested in getting people to reread Tolstoy through the translations and the stories of the translators, but to see him through and see what he's doing in that book, because it's such an amazing, it's one of my favorite novels, but it's such an amazing, when you really read it closely, what's going on and how he moves us, There's my students hate it when I teach Anna Karenina, when I make them read the mowing scenes where Levin it just goes on, because they want to get back to Anna's story and the love story, and Levin's just scything grass for pages and pages. But what you realize with the rhythm of the sentences and the repetition too, is that the sentences are moving back and forward with the motion that Levin's doing in the fields. And it's so beautiful, because you realize that you can't have melodrama all the time, that the drama in the book is it's like a stone set in a ring. You need the ring as well as the stone, and so to have these moments where everything slows down a little, it's really beautiful. And you can really see a master at work, really a writer at work, where he's changing the rhythms and the pace in order to make the dramatic truly dramatic, so yeah.
Yeah, we have come to the final question. See, when you're talking to your students in the class about Kafka, when you're introducing Kafka, to put it correctly, when you're for the uninitiated, what do you say to your students?
I don't usually lecture in class, it's mostly seminars, but I give a first lecture about humor and comedy in Kafka's work, because my students are 18, 19, 20, and they're all going through their deeply existential phase, right? And they love a fellow sufferer, that they love the idea that he's this writer in the attic, and no one would let him write, they just love that image. And so I try and dissipate that very cliched image of Kafka, and especially also his the idea of him being afraid of women, which I don't think is true. I think it was the kind of came out of Freudian criticism after the war, that song was all about his dad and hating his dad, and sure, that was going on, but he's very close to his sisters, and it was a very female household. So I think, and the women that he did have, he of course never married, but all the women he was in love with were professionals, right? Felicia Bauer, Dora Diamont, his last lover, was an actress, And so anyway, so that kind of thing I try and break down, because they're coming in, most of them have read Metamorphosis, and they've read it in this really deeply dark. And to me, it's a really funny story. And I don't persuade all of them. By the end, when we read it, they still don't think it's funny. But I think you try and get the absurdity, because especially I teach a whole semester. So it's 15 weeks of Kafka. It's pretty intense, and so you have to have some levity in there. But I really want them to teach them in some ways how to read closely and well, but also to not take the cliches of writers that we're given, because people like to pigeonhole, a writer is this or that, but to make them think, in a deeper sense about why we have these images of writers and how we can kind of combat that through reading them. Yeah. So, yeah.